Let's see, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Again, thank you so much for being with us today for the next program in our Taking Action Together series. My name is Lisa Bachman, and I am the Executive Director of the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. And I have to first say a huge thank you to Larry and Cinda Goldberg, Jeffrey and Gail Baer, and Ronnie and Donald Hess for their incredible sponsorship of this program. We have many partners who have helped us to spread the word that are listed on our website as well. And of course, I'm very thankful for our team, including Amy, Emma, Hannah, Rachel, and Mike, for helping with all the details, big and small. So a few housekeeping items before we begin. Our speaker will be taking a few breaks throughout the presentation to answer your questions. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a button that says Q&A. Please click on that button to submit your questions. The chat will be open and we'll be putting some important links in there. But if you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A button. And also, this program is being recorded, and we'll send the link to the recording out shortly after the program concludes. And we do hope that you'll share it with friends and family who are not able to attend today. So we are happy to present these events to you at no cost. If you do enjoy today's program, we would greatly appreciate a donation of any size that will enable us to continue providing this really important content. You can visit our website to easily make a gift, and we'll also include a link in the chat. So let's start with today's program. As a Holocaust organization, we know that misinformation and propaganda was a tactic that was used by the Nazi Party to mislead people. At that time, the number of media sources was incredibly small, not like today. Today, we have more news available to us than we can consume. Many of you have called us asking how you can validate the information that you're hearing. And, how do we know what's true and what's not true? And this has led us to a partnership with the News Literacy Project, and it's why we're holding this important program today. We all need tools to guide us on how we can be better consumers of information. When we did our rehearsal for today's program, I'm going to tell you, it blew my mind. You're in for some incredibly useful information today. I'm very confident that you're going to walk away with some wonderful tips on how to approach, evaluate, and verify your news sources. Now, I could not be more excited to introduce you to John Silva. John is News Literacy Project's Senior Director of Professional and Community Learning. He joined News Literacy Project in March of 2017 with 13 years of experience as a middle and high school social studies teacher, where he did teach Holocaust education, and he was in the Chicago Public Schools. He first became involved with news literacy in 2014 when his students engaged in News Literacy Project's original classroom program. A U.S. Marine Corps veteran, John spent several years in corporate telecommunication positions before deciding to become a teacher. He graduated from the University of Illinois at Chicago with a bachelor's degree in teaching of history and has a master's degree in education with a concentration in e-learning from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He became a national board certified teacher in 2012. You'll see, he's incredibly qualified. Our goal in holding these programs is to provide all of you with at least one thing that you can take away and put into action. After hearing today's program, I am confident that you will find at least one thing you can do. Please join me in welcoming John.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you to the Alabama Holocaust Education Center for reaching out and inviting us to join this series. And we are very excited to talk to you this afternoon. So the short version of this is about the difference between being informed and being manipulated. And we're going to talk a lot today about the things that you can do as an individual to take control of your information feeds and to also look at some of your habits and behaviors that we might be able to add some skills to make that a bit easier for you to navigate. As Lisa mentioned, I'm a former social studies teacher. I taught history and civics for a number of years. I'm also very proud of the fact that I was a 2005 teacher fellow for the Holland and Knight Holocaust Remembrance Project, which was an incredible experience. And so, in Illinois, teaching the Holocaust is mandated by state standards. And, the parallels between teaching about the Holocaust in the modern context are very similar to teaching news literacy, because misinformation and propaganda and conspiracy theories and all those, there are many different parallels. And so hopefully you'll see those connections, but we're going to focus mainly on information in the modern context of how we're confronting it today. There's a few things that I really want to get in front of everybody to talk about before we get started. I am here to talk about news literacy, to talk about how we can be more credibly informed. I am not going to tell you this source is good, this source is not. I'm not going to recommend any particular news source over another. And I'm also not here to talk about the various parties involved in the current conflict in Israel, between Israel and Hamas. So this is not about that, although that is obviously a hugely important topic, thread in what we're going to be doing. I want you to open your minds a little bit as we go through this, right? I want you to reflect on the things that you do, the habits that you have, and a bit of your own biases that can get in the way of being more credibly informed. And there are things that we don't even really recognize. And so we're gonna shine a light on some of that. And as we do that, I want you to embrace the discomfort. We don't like our perceptions being challenged. That's not a comfortable thing. And I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. What I do want to do is challenge you to rethink how you view news and how you view news organizations. Because I think a lot of the ways that we view them today has been muddled and distorted and manipulated. And I want to shine a new light on that as we do that. And again, the News Literacy Project, we do not endorse specific news organizations. You will see on our website that there are some standards-based news organizations that we do believe are credible and that we have worked with in the past. We do a lot of work with journalists and news organizations, but we don't endorse when they say this is the most credible source and these aren't. That's not what we do. And we are also rigidly nonpartisan, which is especially important as we go into this year with the presidential election coming up. We follow very strict guidelines in terms of being nonpartisan, not endorsing any particular political views over another. It can be very difficult, but it's important that you understand that this is how we approach our work. Before we get started, we have to acknowledge that where we are right now and where things have been, especially the last couple of years, I don't need to tell you this, but this sort of maps out that anti-Semitism has continued to increase. And since the attacks on October 7th, the rate of increase has gone up. The Anti-Defamation League, tracks all these things, and they have seen in the real world increased incidents of anti-Semitism, but we also see it significantly increasing on social media. There are some social media platforms where things have gotten a little bit better, but there are others where anti-Semitism has gotten a lot worse. So we have to recognize that this is a major problem right now. Likewise, Holocaust denial and distortion is rampant on social media. And it's not just Twitter or Facebook. It's things like gamer tags on gaming platforms. It's on TikTok. It's being shared across so many different platforms. Young people are seeing it all the time in the most random places, like Fortnite or Call of Duty or even Roblox. They're seeing things that are related to Holocaust denial and distortion. And in fact, the way social media platforms has handled it, they've actually gotten worse in the last couple of years. So the ADL has this Holocaust denial report card. And what's interesting is that in the last 2 years in particular, all of their ratings, all their grades have gone down because partially they don't have the capacity to deal with the increase that we've seen, but also the idea of moderating content has become very, very politicized in so many interesting ways. One of my favorite little factoids when we talk about social media platforms, we always talk about the ones who are doing it the worst. But one of the ones that's actually doing the best that we don't often talk enough about is Pinterest. Pinterest has very strict policies in place. They crack down on anti-Semitism, on Holocaust denial and distortion. They crack down on anti-vaccine things. Like Pinterest, I wish some of these other social media platforms would take a page from their playbook, because I think we would see a significant decrease. But putting that part of this aside, we have to recognize our role in all of this, right? When we see this increase in hate online, when we see the increase in anti-Semitism, we see the increase in racism, we see increases in, political partisanship rhetoric that is even worse. What happens is that, our emotions become much more heightened, and we become more emotionally aware of like how things are. And when that happens, we become more sensitive to information that we might perceive as attacking us. And so this is where news literacy becomes very, very important, because the skills of news literacy are about trying to set aside our emotions and our cynicism and approach news and information from a place that's more rational and critical and skeptical, right? We don't want cynicism, we want skepticism. And so this is a bit about what we're going to cover today. We're going to introduce some vocabulary. There are a couple really important terms that everyone kind of needs to be aware of. And then we're going to talk about news media bias. One of the big discussions that's happening online right now is accusations that, the media are pro-Israel or pro-Hamas, right? And certain news organizations are anti-Semitic. And we kind of want to talk about what that looks like, and also like our role in discussions about news media bias and how those biases can lead to emotional manipulation. And when that happens, we can be manipulated by misinformation and propaganda and such. And then as we wrap up, we're going to talk about 3 key tips for how you can stay informed. So the first term is confirmation bias. Hands down, this is the #1 reason why misinformation spreads online. If we see something that agrees with us, that agrees with something we believe, we are likely to accept it without questioning. And when we do that, we might spread it. And so confirmation bias is a very powerful cognitive bias that it happens to all of us. And it's not something that we're generally aware of. We like it when things agree with us. It feels good when things agree with us, right? And we like that positive emotion. And a lot of misinformation, a lot of propaganda is designed to exploit that. And so this is one of the ways that things go viral. Connected to this is motivated reasoning. Think of it this way, that confirmation bias can lead to motivated reasoning, especially if our beliefs are challenged. And what motivated reasoning is that we are going to go look for information, and we are going to interpret information in a way that reinforces our beliefs. A librarian I once worked with described it as a belief in search of confirming evidence, right? It's the opposite of actual rational thinking. It's the opposite of what we might think of as like doing your own research, right? We have a belief, and we're going to go look for anything that proves what we believe or tries to disprove things that disagree with us. It's another cognitive bias. It is a very powerful force in how we process information. And at the heart of these is a lot about our emotions and about our perceptions. And then the last term that I want to have you have in your mind is called hostile media perception. This is not something that we talk a lot about when we talk about news and information today, but it's actually a really important sort of cognitive bias where the basic idea is that the stronger our belief in something, the more likely we are to believe that news coverage is biased against it. It's part of what contributes to that hypersensitivity and this emotional connection to our beliefs. One way that this illustrates, there was a study that was done in the 1980s where they took two groups of college students and they had them watch a football game where the two schools played each other. And they said, we want you to count all the penalties. And in particular, we want you to count the penalties that you think the referees missed. Both groups counted more penalties for the opposing team than they did for their own home team. And they counted more missed calls that would have benefited their team than would have benefited the opposition, right? This is our emotional connection to our belief. It's this emotional way that we process information. And it's very relevant to what's going on today. You know, people have obviously very strong feelings about the things that are happening in the Middle East today. We have very strong feelings about the rise of anti-Semitism in the United States. And the more emotional we are when it comes to that, the more likely we are to kind of give in to this hostile media perception. So a lot of what we're going to talk about as we go deeper into this is sort of our role in how we can take more control over how we process information, and then how we can influence others in a more positive way. So news media bias. This is our academic definition of news media bias. This is what we use with our educators when we work with students, but it's really important to understand that when we talk about bias in the news, it's when there are assumptions or opinions that favor one side of an issue or another that distort news reporting. And one of the things that's difficult in conversations about bias is that a lot of the times the things we're talking about are not actually news. Because we're going to talk about what news is in a few minutes, but news media bias, real news media bias, is often a lot more subtle and nuanced than what we realize. One of the things that's difficult when we talk about this topic is this idea of objectivity, that the media is supposed to be objective. Objectivity is great as an aspirational ideal, but it actually sets an impossible standard, right? Nothing can be truly objective, right? Because we're humans, right? And we make mistakes. Our own biases get in the way. And a lot of times when we're talking about bias in the media, it's really based on our own perception and are really very open to debate and subjective. So when we talk about media and the news, what we really want to focus on is fairness and accuracy. That's what journalists and standards-based news organizations are trying to do when they are reporting the news. They want to be fair to the topic and everyone involved, and they want to be accurate in their reporting. And so when we talk about this, we have to sort of acknowledge our own biases. The way we view the world is based on our own lens, our own lived experiences. It's influenced by the people that we are connected to and surround ourselves with. And so when we talk about information and bias, we don't often think of it based on, you know, are we perceiving it, right? And how are we perceiving it? And no one ever really says that the media is biased in their favor, right? We don't look at the news and say, wow, that's great. They're heavily biased in our favor. When we talk about bias in the news, it's really that it's biased against us. That's that hostile media perception again, right? If something is biased towards us, it feels true when we don't actually see it as bias. And that confirmation bias, that good feeling we get when our beliefs are reinforced, is one of the reasons why these sort of hyper-partisan sources of information are so popular, right? We actually, we kind of gravitate towards those sources that agree with us. And that leads into a couple other key concepts that I want to talk about so that we recognize some things that we can do. We all, maybe intentionally, maybe not, practice selective exposure. If you only get your news and information from a couple of select sources, right? If you are exclusive, like I only get my sort of news from here, here, and here, and I only follow social media accounts that I think agree with me, you're practicing selective exposure. What that means is that you're only exposing yourself to a very narrow lens of information, of very few sources. Along with that comes selective avoidance, right? So if we prefer these sources that agree with us, we're going to exclude things that we think disagree with us, right? If we think they don't agree with us, they have opposing viewpoints, we're going to avoid them. We're going to intentionally exclude them. And a lot of that is based on perception. A lot of that is based on our biases. And what happens, especially on social media, is that we end up being in a filter bubble or an echo chamber, right? The algorithms create the filter bubble where the algorithms are trying to show you content that it thinks you're going to like. So it shows you things that you're going to agree with. And then your social media ecosystem is an echo chamber where you only hear things that agree with you. And when that happens, you're in a very myopic state when it comes to seeing the world, right? You're only seeing it through a very narrow lens. And when that happens, we stop listening to each other. We stop hearing each other. We stop discourse. We're not exchanging ideas. We're just shouting into the ether. And when we shout into the ether, we're only shouting at people who agree with us. And what happens is that we have a breakdown of discourse and dialogue. And I think most of us would agree that that's a major problem with our political lives today. We're not listening to each other. We're not talking to each other. And we may not want to talk to everybody who has a diverse perspective for us, but when we're all in our little bubbles, we're not really being informed. People are just telling us what we want to hear. So I'm going to pause here for the first to see if there's a couple of questions that popped up from that first section.
Oh, sorry, I had a little trouble unmuting there. Thank you, John. I think this has been very, very helpful. We do have two questions.
Okay.
And the first is how TK wants to know how gaming platforms magnify Holocaust denial or anti-Semitism.
So there's two ways that happens, right? I don't know if any of you have young people at home that are active gamers. My son is 14 and he does some gaming. If he's engaged, sometimes if they're engaged in a voice chat with random people, it might be something that just pops up on voice chat or could pop up in the text conversations, right? And sometimes like one of the examples I showed was somebody's gamer tag, right? Their gamer tag was basically Holocaust denial. The extension of that is the platform that's called Discord. Discord is very, very popular with gamers, and there are a lot of these sort of closed chat room ecosystems that where young people in particular go to connect with other gamers. And in that environment, that's another place where not just anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, but a lot of these other things happen. It's where people share it in there, and it becomes kind of passive exposure because people who have these beliefs really, really want to share it, right? They really want to tell people, and they find every opportunity to do so.
Yeah. When you believe something so strongly, it does. That makes a lot of sense. So let's see, we have more questions that are coming into the Q&A now. So thank you to everyone. Caroline would like to know, how do we hear other sources when so many of them are actually trafficking misinformation or anger and hate? We want to open our minds, but when we see things that are just so disturbing.
Right.
How do you
And
handle
so there is a balance there that we want to think about, right? And usually when I talk about this topic with people, part of it is like recognizing if that other person is open to hearing you and if you're open to hearing them. When we talk about these beliefs, the gulf between the two people seems impossible to bridge, but you're not really engaging in these sites. Like if you see a source that's nothing but hate speech and Holocaust denial, like you're not gonna go there. But you might encounter somebody online or even somebody in your own social circles, right? There are ways that you can engage them in conversation. And we have some resources on our website that we can share to have those productive conversations. Um, but it is difficult. I mean, none of this is easy. And talking to somebody who has these beliefs is obviously very anxiety inducing and difficult, but there are ways. Um, that's actually a whole other session that we could talk about. But we'll share some resources that you can take a look at. And then I'll share my email address with everyone towards the end if you want to reach out to me directly for a further discussion.
Yeah, and actually, I really do enjoy the things that you said about keeping an open mind. I have somebody that's very dear to me that at shortly after October 7th was having some views that were very different from mine. And
Hmm.
my first gut reaction was back off. But then
Yeah,
we ended up having a conversation because this is someone so close to me. And we were both able to open each other's minds. Now we didn't change each other's minds, but
right.
we listened and it allowed us to maintain our friendship. Okay,
Hmm.
I want to ask probably one more question, John. Is that okay? And then
Sure.
we'll get back
Yeah.
to the program. So Christopher is asking, what is the psychology behind conspiracy theorists? Why has a segment of the population believed in conspiracy theories? And is there any explanation?
Ooh, yeah, that's a big one.
That's a big
Um,
question.
I do see part of the questions like throughout history. I would say one of the oldest conspiracy theories that I know of was the fact that Emperor Nero deliberately started the Great Fire of Rome um, to clear the way to build a new palace and to build the Colosseum. There was actually an extension of that Nero hated that conspiracy theory so much that he actually created his own conspiracy theory, blaming Christians for the fire, which actually led to a lot of Christian prosecution in ancient Rome. So conspiracy theories has been around for a long time. Um, the basic psychology behind conspiracy theories is about fear and anxiety. Um, and conspiracy theories offer very simple explanations for complex, difficult things, right? The best example I can illustrate this is when the false link between the MMR vaccine and autism was published by Andrew Wakefield, a disgraced doctor from England, right? If the specter of autism is incredibly scary. We don't know what causes it. We know that there's a lot of different variations of it. As a parent, having this tiny little human that is entirely dependent on you for its life, there's a lot of things that make you scared. And this idea that we don't know what causes it, and someone comes along and confidently and definitively says, if you don't want your kid to be autistic, don't give them this shot. It's very simple to hear. It's very easy to understand. It taps into a lot of other fears and distrust, right? And it just makes that fear and anxiety go away. And when that anxiety goes away, again, that feels good. We like that. And then we kind of go deeper into it. Because once we believe something, it becomes that much more difficult to get us out of it.
Okay, so let's keep going, John. There's more
Okay,
questions, but I want to make
sure.
sure we get through all your
Yeah.
information.
I want you to take a second and if I ask you to give me a definition of news, how would you define it? We talk about the news, we hear the news, we watch the news. Did you see the news? Did you hear the news? I want you to think about how you would define it. If I pressed you to give me a dictionary definition. The thing is, we often think of it very broadly, but news has a very specific definition in this context. News is information that informs us. It is designed to inform us. It is fair and impartial and accurate about important events. News is one unique kind of information when compared to lots and lots of others. The reality is, the overwhelming majority of information that we see out there in the world is not news. It's something else. And sometimes it often looks like news. So what should we look for? when we look at it, so this is an example. So this is a news report that was published about a commercial whaling ban in Iceland. So if news is meant to be fair and accurate, if it's meant to be informative, the vocabulary of a news report, the headline is going to be nouns and verbs. Sometimes it might be in a way that's to grab our attention, but it's not going to have adjectives or superlatives, right? It's straightforward. This is what this news story is. It's going to tell us the dateline, where the journalist was and where it came from and who that journalist was, right? One of the biggest red flags, if you see something you think is a news report and there's no name attached to it, it's probably not a news story. It's going to have a lead, which is the first paragraph of the article. This is like the most important thing you need to know. And when you get into the body of a news report, it's going to have all the quotes, all the facts, all the evidence is going to be attributed to a specific source. It's going to tell you where that information came from or who said it. The writing style is going to be in the third person with an active voice, right? The author is not a character in the reporting. And then the word choice, right? The vocabulary is meant to be neutral and trying to avoid emotional language, right? It's trying to inform us. And one of the things that you can think of, like with this example, if when you're reading this, you can determine if the journalist is for or against commercial whaling, you're probably not reading a news report, right? The journalist is trying to tell us about this whaling ban. It's going to tell us about the people who are for it. It's going to tell us about the people who are against it, but it's going to be neutral. The journalist does not have a voice in this. And so that's one of the most important things that we want to be looking for, right? Are we being informed or is it something else? Because so much out there is designed to kind of look like news, but it has another purpose. So we mentioned that news, its purpose is to inform, right? We want to know the who, the what, the where, the when. A lot of what we actually see falls into what we call the opinion zone, especially when we look at news organizations, especially cable television news. Somewhere around 85% of content that we see on like CNN or Fox or MSNBC, so much of that is actually opinion content. It's trying to persuade us. It's trying to tell us what to think or what position to hold on an issue. And sometimes we conflate news and opinion because it all comes from the same source. But we have to learn how to differentiate it. Entertainment is another source. We see a lot of things that kind of look like news or talk about current events. And we have to remember that if it's trying to make us laugh or it's trying to entertain us, it's not news. This is not as common, but we do sometimes see advertising that's designed to look like a news report, and it blends in with other news reporting. And then what we call raw information. This is where we see things that it's in its raw form, like unedited surveillance video, an original document. Nothing has been added to it or removed from it, and we also don't have context. So I want to, and then also propaganda and misinformation. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But I want to emphasize a couple of these to sort of show these key differences, right? So here we have a couple stories about George Santos. So on the left is a news article, and on the right is an opinion piece. This is probably one of the most important things we have to learn how to differentiate and start differentiating, is that an opinion piece has a very different purpose. When we look at opinion journalism, it looks very similar. It's published by the same organization. It has the same fonts and style and headline, font and all that. So we have to look for the differences. And that's where tone, word choice, and that vocabulary is very important, right? On the left, it says how Santos spent donors' money, right? This is what he spent it on. And on the right, it says George Santos is more dangerous than you know, right? The one on the right has much more loaded language. I'm a big fan of a lot of these entertainment programs, The Daily Show, John Oliver, Saturday Night Live, a lot of that. Sometimes they can look very similar, right? But these entertainment programs are meant to entertain us. They use the news and current events as fodder for what they're trying to do, but they're not trying to be fair and accurate. They're not trying to tell us the news. They're using it to make us laugh. And sometimes they're actually also pushing their own opinions, and they are trying to be persuasive. So we can learn a little bit about current events from these, but that's not what they're meant to do. All right, so let's start getting into misinformation and propaganda. So with misinformation, especially with some of the sources, they're trying to look like legitimate news sources, right? They try to have headlines and leads and bylines and things. And so like on the surface, they're trying to have those familiar elements. And with those visual elements, what they're trying to do is appear to be credible when they're actually not. And in that, that is actually part of the manipulation that happens with misinformation and propaganda, is that it tries to make us comfortable and then influence us through the subtleties of the visuals so that we're not actually thinking that much about the actual content. And so this is where being critical becomes so much more important. We have to spend some time and slow down when we're processing information and being aware of sensational language and emotional language. So when we think about news credibility, right? They only publish verified information, right? And they tell us where they were able to verify it. And that is from credible sources, and they tell us who those sources are, and they're giving us information from all the relevant viewpoints and perspectives. They give us background, they give us context, and they tell us the information we need to know to be able to understand what's happening in the story. And in that, they're trying to avoid bias. And the way that they're doing that is trying to emphasize fairness and accuracy. Now, part of that fairness and accuracy is vocabulary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of examples. And the question I'm going to ask is simple. Which do you think is more biased? Right? So thinking about what news media bias is, right? It's language and reporting that skews what we're seeing. And it's about fairness and accuracy. So I'm going to show you two, and I want you to just kind of look at the two and think about which one do you think is more biased? Example A, the headline, top Hamas official Saleh Aruri, who headed West Bank operations, killed in Beirut blast. And then you can see the lead. And then example B, Israel-Hamas war, Hamas leader killed in Beirut blast. So take a look at the language, look at the phrasing, look at the vocabulary, and just in your head, which one would you say is more biased than the other? I'll give you a second to consider that. So why didn't I tell you where these came from? Well, the one on the right is from the one on the left on your screen, example A, is from the Associated Press. The other is from the New York Times. If I had told you where these came from at the beginning, that would have influenced how you evaluated the source, right? Your perception, your viewpoints of the Associated Press, the New York Times, would have influenced this. If you believe the New York Times is more biased against those things that you believe, you would have seen New York Times and you automatically would have said, example B is more biased, and you probably would have done so without even really thinking about it, right? Because it's about perception and it's about that emotional response. If you have some feelings about one of these news organizations, you're going to process that information more emotionally and less rationally. All right, I'm going to show you two more. So we're going to do it again. Example C and example D. Take a look at the language. Senior Hamas official killed in Beirut suburb. Hamas deputy leader killed in alleged Israeli strike in Beirut. You can see, and obviously, that the example D has a little bit more wordy, has a little bit more possibly loaded language. And this is, so I'm going to show you where this came from. And this is going to reinforce what I mentioned about how we perceive certain news organizations. Example C is from Al Jazeera, and example D is from the Times of Israel. Now, I'm not trying to say that one of these is more or less biased than the other. My point here is that we have to recognize way we perceive certain sources, and we ourselves may not be fair in that evaluation if we're letting our emotional response to the source drive how we evaluate it. Right. So this is one of those things that we want you to get your information from more sources. And part of that is kind of reevaluating how you perceive some of these sources. Now, you may look at one of these sources and say, yeah, you know what, I don't like the way they report. I think that they have too much loaded language, and you may decide to not prioritize them, but we really want to encourage you to consider it. So let's dive a little bit deeper into some of this language. And this is probably one of the most important debates that's happening in journalism, and in particular with the coverage of the current conflict, the Israel-Hamas war. It's whether or not we use the term militant or terrorist. So let's just use definitions first. This is from the Oxford English Dictionary. The term militant has a very broad definition. There are many, many different ways that you can describe someone as a militant or being militant, right? It's very, very broad, lots of different applications. The term terrorist has a much more specific definition. But more importantly, the term terrorist is far more likely to have a derogatory connotation to it than a militant. And because it is a much more politicized term, standards-based news organizations are very careful about how they use it, right? Because news organizations are trying to be fair and accurate. And so because terrorist is such a loaded word, such a complex concept, they don't use it as often as some people probably think they should. So I'm going to show you a clip. This is from Katie Couric. She's actually going to talk to Shandy Race from the Wall Street Journal about this.
When you describe Hamas, do you use the word terrorist?
Oh gosh, this is a tough one to answer. Most news organizations don't use the word terrorist for Hamas, and it's a very fair question, but I think that there is obviously an element of Hamas that is, involved in terrorism, but it's much bigger. It's also a political organization. There is a political wing to Hamas, and I think that we're trying to sort of walk that fine line between distinguishing between the terrorism part and everything else that it does.
So the Associated Press style book talks about this explicitly, right? Because this is such a politicized word, they try not to use it. They use language that's more about the specific actions or in direct quotations. So they outline this, and most standards-based news organizations follow the Associated Press style book. But we also have to recognize that this is not static. These are not always set in stone. The BBC got a lot of criticism early on about how they use it, and then the BBC took a step back and they evaluated and they made a change. And so that instead of calling them militants, they are describing it as a prescribed terrorist organization. So this is the thing. We may not agree with these news organizations and how they use this vocabulary, but it's important to understand why they do it, right? If they're trying to be fair and accurate in their reporting, it's all of their reporting, not just reporting on a particular topic. All right, so I'm going to skip that because I see we're kind of running a little on time, a little low on time. I want to see if there are some questions so far on those issues, on what we just covered.
Thank you, John. We do have a few questions. Mary would like to know, is the difference between opinion and fact taught in middle and high school? Because the answer to science seems to be it's only a theory.
We are seeing more and more states adding news and media literacy to their state standards. A lot of this is related to new emphasis on civics education. Here in Chicago, my son is in 8th grade. He actually, this year, he has to take a specific civics course. And part of that is, recognizing like the difference between opinion and fact, right? Facts are straightforward. A fact has evidence. And, this is where things get muddied in the current discussions, right? Because like climate science, for example, the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community is that climate change is real and it is the result of man-made activities. Yet there remains this persistent group of people who, despite all that evidence, say it's not. We have climate science deniers. The same thing relates to the Holocaust, right? There is, so much evidence, right? It is overwhelmingly, definitively proven that the Holocaust happened and all of those things. Yet there still remain people that, despite all of that, through motivated reasoning and their own misinformation fueled beliefs, deny it or distort it. So that is something that's really trying to talk about, because an opinion can have a very specific definition. An opinion, what you believe, has to be based on some sort of evidence that you have considered and has shaped your opinion, rather than just something that you believe because somebody else shouted at you. It is a difficult topic, and when we talk about it in science, that's a whole other issue.
Right. So we have a few people who were very engaged with the 4 examples of bias that you demonstrated. And they're asking if you can provide some examples of what might have been more neutral language.
Well, so obviously one of the obvious ones is that, using the term terrorist, right? So in A and B, neither of them really had loaded language, right? The Associated Press and the New York Times both. That was the thing, is like when you look at those, I actually kind of led you into it, like you're trying to look for the bias as if it's there. And with A and B, there really isn't, because both standards-based news organizations try to keep their language fair and accurate. And neutral is kind of the wrong way of looking at it, right? It's not about neutrality as much as it is you're trying to avoid judgmental language. You're trying to avoid language that sort of leans you towards one position over another. And you're trying to avoid things that have like negative or derogatory connotations, right? It's one thing to call someone a terrorist, and another thing to describe something as a terrorist act. Those can have very different interpretations. And so it really becomes difficult. And we'll talk a little bit more about evaluating language in this last little section.
Yeah, let's move on to the last section, because I think some of the questions that are posed might be answered there. So
yeah. So I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have 3 tips. So there are 3 things that we can do as individuals, and ways that we can kind of talk to others about this. And I'm going to share some stuff. So the number 1 is we have to be intentional, right? We have to slow down. We have to make sure that we are aware of the things that we're doing, and we have to make this active effort. And one of this is diversify our sources. Get out of your echo chamber, get out of your filter bubble, and get news from more sources, from a greater variety of sources, because you might be able to see details about things that you didn't see before. You might get exposed to other viewpoints. Verify information. When you see it, see if other news organizations are saying relatively the same thing. Look at fact-checking organizations, right? Don't just take things as factual because you got it from your regular source. You got to make sure other people are saying the same thing. You got to make sure that it's really happening. And this is really about critical thinking, right? We got to question what we're seeing, right? Are people trying to inform us in a way that's fair and accurate, or are they really trying to influence us? And then, we encourage you to support journalism. Unfortunately, not a lot of us subscribe to the news anymore, especially local news organizations. You have to support local journalism in particular. I think one of the best examples I can talk about that is when we talk about George Santos, for example. There was a small local news organization that was talking about all the problems months before the New York Times reported on it, but people ignored it because it was a small news organization and people were so focused on the bigger picture. Along with being intentional is being mindful, right? Is this news or is this opinion, right? Is this an entertainment show? You know, what am I looking at here? And then be proactive. Go out and look for information. Don't wait for the algorithm to give it to you, because that's a filter bubble. We don't want to be in a filter bubble. We want to be more deliberate. We want to go out and get our information. We want to look it up, and that way we can be much more informed. And as we're doing that, look for signs of credibility. Look for signs that something might not be credible. And the most important question you can ask when you're looking at something is that pause. And you think, okay, is this trying to inform me, persuade me, or manipulate me, right? Because something can be credible and persuasive, right? There can be a piece of opinion journalism that's based on logic and rhetoric, and you know it's supported by evidence, or it might be manipulating us. And avoiding manipulation is being aware of what might be false and misleading. There are some things that happen. A lot of this is based on emotions, and the more emotional something might be, the more likely that misinformation can manipulate us. Sometimes it's about, you know, they'll take it out of context, they'll edit something might be completely fabricated, but the more emotional something might be, the easier it is for us to be manipulated, because when we're talking about misinformation, it's about emotional reasoning, right? We're not thinking about it. We're not being critical about it. We're just responding to it based on whether or not it feels true, right? That's where that confirmation bias comes into play. The hostile media perception, right? Those are emotional thought processes. And that's not how we can be credibly informed. Because it's important to remember that there are a lot of people out there who are trying to manipulate us. They are trying to get us to believe something that is not true. This is an example from our website called RumorGuard. This account posted these images claiming that a group of Palestinian activists had removed the American flag in San Francisco and put a Palestinian flag up. It's an authentic image, but it has been selectively edited to show that that's actually not what happened at all. And when you look at these two images, if you see them separately, you're going to have a different emotional response to it. You may not like the one on the right, but you're not going to have nearly as strong a reaction as the one on the left that's designed specifically to manipulate you. And part of this also relates to propaganda. The U.S. Holocaust Museum defines it as biased information that's designed to shape public opinion and behavior. And there are some ways that this happens. There are a lot of different ways of simplification, making things seem very simple when they're way more complicated. But probably one of the most important ones is division. Propagandists and misinformation sources are trying to emphasize and widen the gaps between us and them. And this is very apparent when we see some of the things happening right now. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples to emphasize this, especially on social media. This post in December falsely claimed that a Palestinian child had been shot by an Israeli sniper. I'm not going to show you the video. It's a heart-wrenching video. It's very difficult to watch. But the thing is, it's an authentic video, but it had nothing to do with things that were happening in Gaza. It was actually from an attack in Syria. So it's a real video, but it had nothing to do with the Israel-Hamas war. So this is one example where things are taken out of context and they're repackaged in a way to manipulate us. And so one of the last big points when we talk about propaganda, we don't see propaganda in things that we agree with. So remember, propaganda is about emotional manipulation. It's about manipulating us and reinforcing beliefs or widening things. So this is a tweet from the State of Palestine's official Twitter account. They put out a lot of these deeply emotional things, right? They're trying to humanize what's happening. And when we see this, like, we may not see this because of our echo chambers and our filter bubbles, but if we do see it, you know, depending on your views, you may embrace it or you may ignore it. And maybe not recognizing that the same thing is happening on the other side, right? Depending on which you see first, we may forget that in these conflicts, emotional manipulation is very powerful. And part of the ways that people are trying to influence us is through this emotional manipulation. right? That's not to say that neither of these is true. They're both true, right? But they're trying to manipulate us for different purposes. Likewise, we might see something like this, where this is from the Israel Twitter account, right? This is trying to generate negative emotions, right? And so when we see that, we might feel outrage and anger, right? And then because social media is what it is today, we may not see the other side of it. And we may not recognize it. And when you see these things side by side, hopefully it makes you realize that, there are lots and lots of people out there trying to manipulate us. And it is very easy to manipulate us. The more emotional we are, the stronger our emotional reaction, the easier it is. And we just don't want to be there. So when you take on this role, when you become a little bit more intentional, you can be a legitimate source. You can be seen as someone that people trust as a source of information because we're sharing things, we're talking to each other. We like those personal connections. So you want to be seen as a source of credible information. You want to be seen as part of the solution. You don't want to reinforce false beliefs. You don't want to spread conspiracy theories any more than you want anyone else to do. So you can take on this, and we just say verify before you amplify. And then I'll leave this up. This is our website at newslit.org. You can find out a lot more about our resources, about our organization. We're going to share some additional things. And it looks like we have about 4 minutes, but I can stay on a little bit longer so that we can hit some questions.
Yes. Thank you, John. There was a question. Sorry, one of the questions disappeared. Is there any advice that you have on how we can guide students to find good news sources? We know so many of our students go to social media. What's a good way for us to talk to the younger generation?
Well, I mean, the first thing is we want to encourage our educators to include news literacy in the curriculum, right? There's a lot that we can do. So one of the things that we want to talk to young people about is that, well, there's two parts to it. One, you are going to encounter misinformation pretty much everywhere you go online. And you have to realize that there are people who are actively trying to fool you, to manipulate you. And so what you have to be able to do is know what credibility is, right? That's the most important question that a lot of young people need to learn is like, what does it mean for a news source or a source of information to be credible, right? Because when they have that, they know what to look for and they know what to avoid. Right. And so if we're trying to be informed, we just watch out for loaded language, for biased language. And then as they do that, they kind of build this partly a mental checklist, but they also build a roster of places that they go for information. And so, being critical, being intentional, and knowing what to look for is a major part of the effort.
And I know we're getting close to time. I want to ask one last question. And I know, when we talked before, it was one of the biggest questions that I know I had in my mind, and a couple of people have asked it. Are there some places we can go to help us verify a story that?
Yeah. So obviously one of the ones that we will talk about is RumorGuard, right? We have our own fact-checking website, and it doesn't just fact check like some places do, but it tells you like how we know, how we figured it out, where it came from. RumorGuard is one, but but in RumorGuard we reference a number of others. The most important things to look for when you look at a fact check: reputable fact-checking organizations show their work. They don't just tell you something is true or not. They tell you how they know, how they figured it out, what did they learn, what's the real context. And there are a number of fact-checking organizations out there, PolitiFact, factcheck.org. One thing to look for is the IFCN, the International Fact-Checking Network. You can find people that follow those sort of global standards. That's a good place to look as well.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank everybody for attending today. I know I've gotten a number of really good nuggets of information, and hopefully everybody has a little something that they can take away to help you all be better consumers of news and content and information. We do have a number of additional programs coming up where we're going to dive a little bit deeper into all of these concepts. And we want to make sure that you keep an eye on our website for the Taking Action Together programming. We've got a number of programs that are listed out there, and we've got many more that we're going to be putting up on the site within the next couple of weeks that we're still trying to confirm. So we're really going to keep going into a lot of these programs. Again, thank you all for attending. These programs are provided to you at no cost. Any gift of a donation would be tremendously appreciated. And the recording will be distributed as soon as it takes a little bit of time to download it, but as soon as we can get it posted, we will send everybody an email. We would love it if you would share it with your family and friends, so anybody who missed it and didn't have an opportunity to see it will be able to view it. John, thank you for joining us today. You and the News Literacy Project team have
Thank
been
you so much for having us. We really look forward to continuing the conversation and hopefully helping with future programming.
Yes, and we look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks on January 24th for our next program, where our friends at Yad Vashem are going to be talking about the twin dangers of silence and indifference. You won't want to miss that one. And we hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for being with us for lunch.